Okay, so this deep dive, it's Asmongold, right?
Yeah.
And wow, some of this stuff like the dead rat alarm clock and then years of, what did he call it, dental odyssey?
Huh?
I mean, even I was kind of surprised by some of this stuff. But I guess that's the point, right? This is why we do these deep dives, to kind of get under the hood and figure out, like, what makes someone tick, especially when they're ticking to a different beat than everyone else.
Yeah, and it's really common, like the initial reaction is to see those outward signs of someone being different and think, "Oh, okay, this is a cry for help." But what if we flip that script a little bit? What if with this guy with Asmongold, what if this isn't him trying to get attention, but it's more about like him trying to establish control, like almost like think of it as like a barrier,
Yeah.
a barrier against a world that just feels inherently chaotic.
And that's interesting because even going back to, like, when he was a kid, he talks about feeling different, like really profoundly different. Like he was always on the outside, kind of looking in, you know what I mean? And he talks about how social rules, all that stuff, felt like this weird performance that he could never quite grasp. And that makes me wonder if maybe this points to something deeper. Like, could this be a case of neurodiversity?
It's definitely possible. I mean, it's a possibility, right? Neurodiversity, it really just means that, brains work differently. And if you're someone who is neurodivergent, trying to navigate a world that's built for neurotypical brains, it's incredibly isolating, especially when you think about those key developmental years, childhood, adolescence, all of that. And it often leads to exactly what you just described, this feeling of being a spectator in your own life.
Which I think makes his reaction to that whole baseball incident back in high school even more fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is where we really see that disconnect, like where societal expectations and then Asmongold's actual internal experience, they clash in a really stark way. Like most kids, they hit someone with a baseball, they're going to feel bad, right? Guilty,
Right.
remorseful. But Asmongold, he describes feeling joy.
Because it worked. Like he finally, mastered something.
It could be, yeah, maybe. But it also could suggest like a fundamentally different way of processing emotions, like his neurology, his wiring. It's not necessarily conforming to what we consider normal. And as he gets older, like into adulthood, he becomes really aware of this difference. He even admits that he's actively trying to hide his true emotions.
There's that observer thing again. Like he's always analyzing. He's always aware of how he's being perceived by other people. It's almost like he's saying, hey, I know you think I'm strange, but just, give me a minute, okay? I'm working on it.
Exactly. And it's in this context of feeling like a total outsider, of always watching his own back, that he gets hit with some really tough stuff. Like, think about it. Financial instability, having to take care of his mom while she's sick. For someone already struggling to connect, you pile that on top. Talk about isolation.
Essentially, he retreats even further, right? Like
Yeah.
leans into this whole thing of rejecting how he's supposed to be, how he's supposed to act. Like all those years of feeling different, they solidify into, all right, fine, I'm different, whatever. And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
That's what ends up making him successful.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating paradox when you think about it, right? This embrace of what he calls, and I'm using his words here, degeneracy, which we should probably unpack that term a little bit later. But this embrace of degeneracy, it becomes his brand. Like it's his unique selling point in a world that's full of these picture perfect online personalities. It's like he kind of stumbles into this weird, I don't know, authenticity, or at least like the performance of it, and it's right here where he's finding success, but he's also isolating himself, that we start to hear him use this term, degeneracy.
Which honestly, when I first heard it, I kind of cringed, But maybe that's like the whole point, to be provocative, to
Yeah.
sort of push back against those prepackaged ideas of what's okay, especially online.
Oh, it's definitely provocative, but I think for him, for Asmongold, degeneracy, it's not about like rejecting what's normal or whatever. It's more about like agency. Yeah, no, like he's taking back control. He's flipping the script on anyone who ever said he was different or like not good enough.
Okay, but I got to push back a little here. Because even with all that, like his living situation back then, let's just say I'm glad smell-o-vision never took off, okay?
Right.
No heat, rotting teeth, that whole thing with the maggots in the snack box. Like, was that part of the performance too?
Yeah, I think it's important to like approach that part of his story with a little sensitivity, right? It's easy to focus on the outward stuff, the kind of shocking stuff, but what we're really seeing is how someone copes when they're dealing with like really deep emotional pain.
So it's not just chaos. It's more like he's shutting out a world that's already hurt him. He actually says that caring less about people, it brought him some peace. which even he admits is kind of messed up, right?
Oh, for sure. That really stood out to me because it gets at this conflict we all face. Like, we need connection, right? It's human, but we're also terrified of being vulnerable, of getting hurt.
And with him, with Asmongold, that fear gets like amplified because all this awful stuff happens. He loses his mom, his relationship falls apart, his dad gets sick. It's like his whole world is just crumbling around him.
Exactly. And when your go-to move is to shut down, to push people away, then dealing with grief and loss, it's almost impossible. It makes sense that he would retreat even more.
It's like he's building walls instead of bridges, which, now that I say it out loud, sounds incredibly lonely.
Yeah, it's a lonely way to live, no doubt, but it also shows like how resilient he is, you know? He figures out a way to survive, to even thrive in a situation that would crush a lot of people.
And this is where it gets really interesting because he's doing all of this, the good, the bad, the just plain gross, in this incredibly public way, right?
Oh.
Streaming it all. So he's withdrawing, creating this like fortress of solitude, but he's also broadcasting every move he makes to millions of people.
And that, I think, is where Asmongold's story stops being about one guy and starts to tell us something about ourselves,
Yeah.
about why we're so obsessed with authenticity, or at least the idea of it.
It's weird, right? Like we say we want authenticity, we want people to be real, but we kind of want it from a distance, as long as we're not the ones dealing with the literal garbage, we can feel good about keeping it real.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic when you think about it, right? This is a guy, Asmongold, who seems to have completely rejected, like, caring what other people think, right? And he ends up in a place where he could easily conform. Like, he's got the money, he could get the teeth fixed, clean the place up, hire, like, a whole team of chefs if he wanted to. But
Yeah.
he doesn't, or at least not completely.
He talks about how he still lives in the same house, works at the same desk.
Yeah.
It's like his world has changed, but he hasn't. Like that part of him, that core, it's still that same kid who felt different, who felt like he didn't belong.
And that just goes to show you how deeply ingrained these things are, these coping mechanisms, this detachment, this indifference. It's not like a choice he made one day. It was a gradual thing built up over years of feeling like he was the odd one out. It's not surprising that those patterns are hard to break, even when things get easier.
Makes you think, right? Like, what if fitting in was never really an option?
Mhm.
What if those social rules, those expectations, they never really made sense to you? Where do you go from there? How do you find your place in a world that feels like it's speaking a different language?
It's a really good question. And honestly, I don't think this deep dive gives us all the answers, you know? But it does give us a way to think about people who don't fit in, who challenge our ideas of what's normal, what's acceptable.
It's like sometimes the things that seem the strangest, the most off-putting, they're really just like defense mechanisms, ways of dealing with a world that can be really harsh, especially if you don't fit the mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So next time you come across someone who seems, I don't know, like they're trying to be provocative, like they're rejecting everything, just take a second, look a little closer. You might be surprised by what you see.
Definitely something to think about. All right, everyone, that's another deep dive in the books. We'll be back next week with another look at the lives of fascinating and sometimes baffling people. Until then, stay curious.